Shabbat Shalom. In the Talmud, there's a piece from Rabbi Hanina that is often quoted by rabbis, theoretically. This week, I want to quote it as truth. And it says, "I have learned much from my teachers, more from my colleagues, but most of all from my students." And never has that been more true for me than this week in our Torah on Tuesday class. You see, we were studying the opening of the second part of the Torah portion, the part that we read this morning, the part that Ava read from, where we read about how a person who has been outside the community, suffering from this mysterious disease that the Torah calls tzarat. We don't know what it is, but we do know that it isn't leprosy. It's probably some kind of fungal thing. Either way, the person has been outside the community with it, and they're told to come back into the community once they are well again. And the circumstances of the person's exile and the pronouncement of their being cured are told very briefly indeed. Outside the camp they go while they have the disease, and once the priest sees after a period of time that they are well again, then they can come back, and then you have a whole series of colorful and really rather complicated rituals, after which the person, by gradual degrees, is readmitted to their tent within the camp. And it was Mark Samuels, who's sitting right there, who noticed what all of us had missed, which is that the Torah says absolutely nothing whatsoever about the process of how the person becomes well. There is no mention of any kind of therapy or treatment or cure or anything like that. All we know is that they go outside the camp, something happens, and then they're well, and they're able to come back in. And all the emphasis is placed on the bookends of the process. We know an awful lot about the diagnosis, and we know an awful lot about what happens after they come back. We know nothing whatsoever. The Torah is completely silent about what happens in between. Total blank. And if you think about it, this is, I don't know whether the directors and producers of a series like, say, House, of which I am a devotee because, after all, the lead actor is one of my countrymen, a good half of the program is taken up with the drama of the diagnosis. Has the patient got this? No, they haven't. Have they got that weird thing? No, it's obviously not that. And then there's a breakthrough moment, and then it's as if it cuts to the person being okay again. You get the patient sat up in bed, they look a bit perkier, perhaps there's a coda about how they're going to go back into their life, and then the credits roll. And once again, there's a silence around the actual healing part of the process. And I find myself asking why that is, and I found myself asking what we can learn from those silences. And I think that both in the Torah and in the reiteration of that process that we have somehow assumed in every medical drama that we ever watch, we can learn something about the nature of healing. And before I go on, I want to draw an important distinction, and that's the distinction between healing on the one hand and cure on the other. And those of you who've heard me speak before know that I love internet dictionaries, and I love to look at the original meaning of words. So often I went to the internet and dictionaries. And I want to suggest that there is a word for cure in Hebrew. The word for cure in Hebrew is the word hivri, which comes from the adjective bari, which connotes not only health, but also this reassuring sort of thuggy solidness. In fact, the word for bullies in Hebrew, birionim, comes from that word bari, yeah? Rugby player solid. Or as we would say in Yiddish, a gesinterjing, yeah? And hivri, which is the word for cure, means to cause somebody to become solid, to reassemble somebody, if you want. Implicit in the verb is the assumption that it is possible to change the state of someone or something that has been broken back into its original solid form. And that, I suggest, is the Hebrew for cure. Because that's what happens with cure. Cure puts us in retrograde. Something bad that happened is systematically undone, and we go back to being solid. But I want to suggest that healing is not cure. I want to suggest that healing is something else entirely, because as anybody who has ever been sick with anything at all, however trivial, knows very well, you never come back from the experience exactly the same as the way you went in. And as my colleague and study partner, who I didn't know would be here this morning, Rabbi Leslie Bergson, sitting there, she put it very succinctly when we learned Talmud together this week. She said, you never recover. Recovery is something that we would like to imagine takes place. Recovery is actually a bit of a fantasy. Recovery is cure. Recovery is hivri, the reboot, to be put back to exactly the place that we were. But we know that after sickness, after we have been healed, we are not the same. And Hebrew, in its wisdom, has a separate word for healing, because healing is not the same as cure. And we know this word because it occurs very often in our prayers. And indeed, our prayers for healing are often based on the prayers for healing that were recited by other greater individuals. So when we did the prayer for healing this morning in the service, Cantor Aronoff sang the words of Moses when he prayed for his sister's healing. Elna refana la. Please, God, heal her. And those are the words that we sing on Shabbat. And every week in our morning, afternoon, and evening Amidah, we quote, our words are adapted from the words of the prophet Jeremiah, Refa'eni Adonai va'erapeh, heal me, God, and I shall be healed. And those words are put into the plural for us to say in our Amidah 3 times a day, every day, except on Shabbat, when we say the other words. And the origin of this healing word, the etymological origin of the word Rapha, means to join together, to darn or to stitch. And anybody who's ever darned a sock knows that the one thing that you don't get after you've darned your sock is a whole sock that is exactly the same as the sock that you started out with. It's a different assumption from Hivri. When we heal, the broken thing does not become solid again in the same way. When we heal, you can still see where the fractures were. Although how they may be drawn together when we're talking about ourselves healing rather than about a sock being repaired, how the pieces come together is a mystery. And that mystery takes place in the silence outside the camp. So I've been thinking this week that what is it that goes on in that silence? What is that mysterious process of healing? And I realize, and I want to share with you the realization, that what is healing is one of those questions that needs to be lived. It's not one of those questions that can be answered in a flourish of rhetoric from the bima. It's not a tada question, yeah? It's a question that painstakingly needs to be lived through as a process. But there are 3 ideas about healing that I would briefly like to share with you. And the first is that human beings have a role in the healing process. We cannot do what happens outside the camp, but nonetheless, we are not excluded. And there's a series of scenes that are played out. It's one of my favorite Talmud texts to share with people. There's a series of tableaus or photographs, if you want. I guess they'd be YouTube videos these days, that are played out on the pages of the Babylonian Talmud. The rabbis are discussing the very troublesome problem of why do we become sick? And the idea that still floats around with us today that maybe you get sick because you're a special person in God's eyes. The rabbis call this Yisurin shel Ahava, the sufferings of love. And we're more familiar with it in the format of, you know what, God only sends you just as much pain as you're capable of dealing with. So if you get a lot of pain, you must be a very special person. And the rabbis have a lot of trouble with that idea, just as we do. And they try to demonstrate how that idea doesn't work by a series of snapshots. So Rabbi Yochanan, who we may think of as the Justin Bieber of the Talmud, he's the poster boy of the Talmud, very, very handsome. And I always think of him as blonde, and the Talmud observes that he's clean-shaven. He never grew a beard. Rabbi Yochanan gets sick, and another rabbi comes in, and without doing anything else, announces to Rabbi Yochanan, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" Very cryptic phrase. And Rabbi Yochanan says, "No." And the first rabbi stretches out his hand and raises up Rabbi Yochanan from his sickbed. Cut and fast forward to Rabbi Yochanan being the visitor to another rabbi. And you see, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't get it. He sits down by his suffering friend's bed, and he tries all sorts of things to make him feel better. He says, "Maybe your suffering is because you didn't learn enough Torah." And the friend lies there. He says, "Okay, maybe your suffering is because God loves you very much." And his friend lies there. Maybe, you know what? I also suffer. And here's a terrible story about what happened when I was suffering. And his friend lies there. And then suddenly the light goes on, and he remembers what he's supposed to do. And he says to his friend, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" And his friend says, "No, they're not." And Rabbi Yochanan stretches out his hand and raises up his friend. Now, I think we have to read these texts in a way that isn't literal. We can't just go into a sick friend and say, "Are you enjoying yourself?" and have our friends say no, and then we can stretch out our hand and make them all better. That's cure. That's not the language of healing. But rather, this suggests that it's our hand, and only our hand, that is capable of raising up our sick friends, metaphorically speaking. And this is why it's such a mitzvah, such a commandment to visit the sick, because we have something that only we can bring to the process of healing. None of us can cure. Only outside the camp is where healing happens. But nonetheless, we have a role to play. We're all healers. Thought number 2 is that when the Metzorah, when the sick person is brought back into the camp, there's an outburst of ritual and symbol. And I want to draw 2 aspects of that to our attention. One is a strange ritual we read about this morning that happens with 2 birds. One is killed, one is left alive. And the live bird is dipped in the blood of the bird that's been killed and then allowed to fly free over the field. And I wonder if this is a message about how our trauma still marks us, even though we are the live bird. We are marked when we've been sick with the blood of the dead bird before we can fly out again over the field. We've been touched by the mystery of what it means to be healed. And the second aspect of that is that the person is welcomed back into the camp with a ritual that almost exactly mirrors the ritual that is used to anoint a high priest. And I think we have to be careful about how we read that. To think that we are made royal by our sufferings is, I think, misleading. Rather, I think this is a ritual to say that in the same way as the high priest is touched, marked by mystery, so we too, when we are healed, have been touched and marked by mystery. It leaves its imprint on the extremity of our bodies. It leaves its imprint on the way that we hear, the ear is marked. It leaves its imprint on the way that we act in the world because our hands are marked. And it leaves its imprint on the way that we walk in the world because our feet are marked by the mysterious process of healing. And one final thought to locate us in time. We are standing in the period between Pesach and Shavuot when we count the Omer, we count the days between the 2 festivals. And I have a friend and colleague in England called Jacqueline Nichols, who is a visual artist. And every year she takes upon herself to create one piece of art for each day of the Omer. And after Shabbat, I want to refer you to her project. She's creating drawings each day of the Omer of broken objects. And the project is called Gathering the Broken. And the commentary is provided by a colleague from New York, Amichai Lau-Lavi. And day upon day upon day, these two artists, one visual, one with words, are considering what it means to be broken and what it means to be repaired. So 3 aspects of that area outside the camp, of that Torah silence for us to think about, that teach us about the deeper mystery of healing. My thanks go to Mark for his question, because it's his question that produced this sermon. And I hope that we have found what we can take away from that area outside the camp. We don't understand the alchemy of what it means to be healed, but we can support, and we can acknowledge, and we can gather the broken pieces together with compassion as we heal ourselves and we heal each other. Shabbat Shalom.